Welcome back, guys. Today I'm going to be editing your guys' photos that you guys have sent me. I did a little Instagram survey and 96% of you guys said you guys wanted to see this video where you guys send me some photos and I edit them for you and show you just my basic process. I'm going to be using Adobe Lightroom today. If you guys have never used Lightroom before, this might be a little bit more advanced, but for sure this is a good place to learn. And you should be using Adobe Lightroom if you're doing photography. It's probably the most powerful tool for color grading and light corrections and stuff like that. So yeah, I've chosen 5 photos. I was actually blown away by how many photos you guys sent me. I really appreciate the huge response to this, and obviously I couldn't pick everybody's photos. I picked 5 photos that I feel like I can do something on, and if your photo wasn't picked, it doesn't mean that it wasn't a good photo. It just means that either it looked really good as it was, or I didn't feel like I could do enough to it in my editing process to make it worth putting in the video. And obviously none of this stuff is how you're supposed to edit, it's just my style. Let's jump into my computer here. So this first photo that I have here, I can see that it was taken at 1/60th of a second, at 4.5, ISO 100. All looks good there. This was sent in by Michelle, good friend of mine from Keats. Shout out Michelle. She's a super good photographer and she was kind enough to send me this to work on. So basically the first things I do when I look at a photo is I look for the contrast, the brightness, and the color. Brightness looks perfect, you nailed it there. With my photography I typically do like a more pastel look, so this is a good contrast. I might add a little bit more, and then the color, I mess around with the color probably the most. So when I start, I always start at the bottom here and I go to my blue primary, and once again this is just what it's not how everybody should do it, it's just my process. I usually start at the blue primary, I bring the blue primary down, and then I go to red primary, I bring that up and the saturation of it down, and that kind of adds like teals and makes all the reds and oranges kind of a more popped out like pinky look. Or salmon look to it, and that's just kind of a style I like. I like to have color in all my shadows, so if you see down here, this shadow isn't completely black, it's a little bit bluey, and that's kind of what I like. Now I might bring the green primary up, and you'll see that changes their skin tone. So there are some greens and yellows in her skin tones there, and then I'll play with the shadows just to see what I like. It depends on the photo itself. Usually it doesn't make a big difference. Then I go to my sharpening and I just add a little bit of sharpening to every photo. With your split toning panel here, you'll notice most people in like cinematography and photo editing have a certain style where basically the highlights are warm and the shadows are cold, and that's just kind of how our eyes are used to seeing things, and it gives a cinematic look. So this is the perfect place to do so. You'd make your highlights yellowish and then increase your saturation a little bit. Not too much. This can be really powerful if you use it too much, like you can really blow things out. So just a little bit does the trick. Now in shadows, I usually put it to blue or teal, not quite blue, and then I bring that up to where I think it looks about good, which is about there. A really handy shortcut if you're using Lightroom is pressing the slash button, which shows you your before and your after so far. So obviously there's not a lot that you can see quite yet, but I've just kind of changed the tone to a more teal color and changed up the skin tones a little bit, and now I'm going to scroll past the HSL tab all the way up to our basic portion here. Now I might increase the exposure a little bit, just a littlest bit, and then I'm going to crush the blacks just a tiny bit, lift the shadows a little bit, lift the whites a little bit. Michelle, you did a really good job exposing this photo, so there's not a ton to do here. I might add a little bit more clarity, and that also adds contrast when you add clarity. That looks about good. I like where the saturation is. The one thing I might do is you see that the light is hitting the left hand side of her face here, so I'm actually going to add a fake sunlight coming in from the left. So the way you do that, you click on the graduated filter, and then you make your sun-like settings. So sun is warm, it's usually a little bit more red than green, and its exposure is pretty high. So then you're going to come to the corner or the side, whatever you want to do, and you're just going to drag in while holding down. And obviously that's a little bit much, so we can take down the yellow and the purple, maybe bring up the highlight a little bit more, and then I'm just gonna make it faded. I like how that looks. I might get rid of some of the saturation from that. It still looks like it's a little bit too yellow. So let's just cut the yellow out, and that looks good. Okay, so now the final thing that I usually work on when it comes to portraits is the skin tones. After you've done all your corrections, it's important to make your skin tones look as natural as possible, which can also be some of the hardest things. Our eyes are really accustomed to seeing skin tones, so when it looks weird, it really throws off the whole photo, and that's a huge thing you see in a lot of photos on Instagram and stuff like that. It's just the skin tones just don't look right and it looks unnatural. So that's one thing that you really got to try your best to try and fix. I'm also going to bring up the saturation in the blues. Basically, if you don't know what HSL is here, HSL is a tab where it separates each individual color into some sections here where you can change the hue of every color, which is like you can make reds either more orangey or more pinky. You can change the saturation of every color, and you can change the luminance of every color. So instead of going up to the tab up here where you're just changing those settings for the whole photo, you can break the photo down into more parts. And this is super helpful. If you look at a photo and you say, okay, the skin tones are oversaturated, and then you turn the saturation of the whole photo down, then it gets rid of everything else. So it's a lot better to come into here and just turn the saturation of the skin tones down. So if we want to turn the skin tones down, which I think we should, we'd look at the skin tones and they're an orangey type color. So we're going to come to the saturation for orange and just bring that down a little bit. And already that corrects it quite a bit. And we might bring up the red a little bit for her lips. And then the lips look too orange. They just look fake. So we'll take the red hue, which is what her lips are, and we're going to bring that to more of a pinky type color and away from the orange side. And that should correct things a little bit there. And then you can just kind of play around with the skin tones and see what looks natural. Like obviously if I brought it here, obviously that doesn't look natural, and neither does that. We're gonna find a happy medium between the two, which I think will be around there, I wanna say. And a good rule of thumb is if you ever wanna check if your skin tones still look good, you can usually trust the original photo. We can see the whole photo has gotten a little bit more blue. So that does change the skin tones a little bit. I think I'm just about happy with that. I might bring it down a little bit and then bring up the saturation a little bit again. And I think that looks good. One other thing you can play around with is your luminance for your skin tones. You can either make the skin tones brighter or darker. We can find where it looks just about right, which I think is probably around there. Reds can come up a little bit too. I think that looks great. I usually like to play around with my blues a little bit and see how it's affected by that, and it doesn't seem like much is. The rest of this photo is pretty undersaturated, so that gives it kind of like a moody look, and I like that, and I want to keep that. So I think we're just about done for this. The one thing I might do is just add some bokeh, some fake bokeh to the photo. If you don't know what bokeh is, it's the effect where the background of the photo is out of focus, and that brings your attention to the foreground or the subject, and our subject in this photo is obviously her. So we want to make everything else a little bit more out of focus than her. So to do that, we select a radial filter and we just put it right over her face here, and then bring it out until it's kind of spread out across the whole photo. And then we'll come here, we'll just reset all of our settings, and then the only settings we're going to have on this radial filter are we're going to turn clarity down and we're going to turn sharpness down a little bit. And it's going to be hard to notice, but when you select this, everything that's red here is becoming more out of focus, or it's having less clarity and it's having less sharpness. So that's exactly what we want, and that looks about good. So that's what I do for this photo, and I think it looks really awesome. Thank you, Michelle, for sending it to me and letting me edit it. Now let's go on to the next photo. This photo is from Ashley Galvin, next year's Keats photographer. Ashley's a really good friend of mine. She's super good at photography, and she actually sent me a bunch of photos to edit, and I have 2 of them here. I'm gonna start with this one, and you can see her settings up here. She was using 1/400th of a second, f1.8, and ISO 100 on a 50mm f1.8 lens. This is a really good lens choice, Ashley. I love this. The Nifty 50 is one of my favorite lenses ever. The 50mm f1.8 is a great lens, and you can see what it does to the photos here. This photo looks awesome. The background's super out of focus, and that's because the lens has an aperture of f1.8. Basically, the smaller the number for your f-stop, so f1.8, the wider open your camera lens can become, and the wider open your camera lens is, the more out of focus your background can become. So you can see how out of focus that is in the background, and it really isolates the subject, which looks great. The first thing I'm gonna do with this photo is I'm just gonna crop it a little bit. I think it'd be look a little bit better if it's just a slightly tighter crop. Just like that, where your eyes are on the rule of thirds line, and then crop that in. I think that looks great. The colors in this photo are awesome. It's obviously like a sunny day at the beach during sunset or something, and I like that mood. It's a nice spring mood, like you're on vacation. So I'm gonna play with that. I think I'm gonna first just add some sun flare to the side, just like we did on the other photo, but I might even do it more than we did. So I'm just gonna drag in our graduated filter again. I'm gonna bump the exposure even more, actually. I think if we drag that out a little bit more, and then I'm going to take down the saturation of the yellows and the purples a little bit more, and we're just going to have a nice strong sun coming in from the side. I think that looks nice. And obviously we're going to do more to this photo, and what we're going to do is we're going to come all the way down to the bottom just like we did last time. Take our blue primary, push it down, and then red primary up, saturation down, and already we're seeing a big difference to the colors. I might work on that graduated filter a little bit more afterward to make it look more natural, but for now it looks good. We're gonna turn our greens up because I like the greens up, and for this one probably our shadows. Let's do green shadows. So one thing that I really like with this photo is the blues it has in it. Now obviously these chairs shouldn't be that blue. In the original photo there's kind of just a blue overcast from the pants, but I also want to change up these greens in the background to make them a little bit brighter but less saturated. So let's come here to our HSL tab, go to luminance, and just turn up the luminance for green, which we'll see will affect the background. And usually bushes and trees and stuff also include yellow, so turning out the yellow will also affect the background more like that. Perfect. And then we'll go up to our saturation, and we'll just bring down the saturation of the green, I think, a little bit, and a little bit of the yellow, just to keep the attention on the foreground. And let's change the greens to more of a yellowish tone so that we get that tropical feel and not a cold feel to it. And we're going to change our yellows to more of an orangey tone. Basically, when I'm going through a photo, I want to try and keep the whole photo to 2 or maybe 3 types of color. Manipulate this hue tab here so that all the colors in the photo are basically just 2 colors. My 2 favorite colors are teal and purple for photos, and then obviously I'm also gonna have to include the orange of the skin tones, but in terms of things that are outside of the skin tones themselves, I like to keep teal and purple. Now that's mainly for nighttime photography. If it's daytime photography, it's usually teal and orange, which works really well, and that's kind of what I'm doing here. I've taken out the green from here, this kind of bluey green. I've made the blue of her outfit more teal colored and made this more orange colored, and that looks like that. I like that look, and let's just work with our skin tones a little bit here. I'm gonna take the saturation of them down just a tad, and then we will work with the lips so that they're more natural, make them more pink, and then oranges, maybe do around there. I think that looks good. Now I want to take the exposure of the whole photo up a little bit just to give it that bright summer type vibe. The shadows can come up a little bit, and the highlights can come down on her forehead, blacks up a little bit, and that's looking really good. I think I'm going to play around with this graduated filter a little bit more just so that it doesn't look quite as unnatural, but I think it looks pretty nice. I think if we just move it back like that, let's compare it to the original. That versus that would be probably how I edit this. I might spend a little bit more time and do some more brushing to get rid of some of like this blue on the whites and stuff, but obviously that might take a while because you're gonna have to go in and make sure you brush everything perfectly, and I don't want to make this video quite that long. So those are little things that you could detail. I might also try and get rid of some of the stuff on the table in Photoshop and maybe get rid of some of these creases. Basically, you want to eliminate anything that your eye might jump to when you're looking at the photo. So if you're looking at this photo, you see that there's this little line here that your eye kind of gets distracted by, and you might just want to use a tool like this, just mask this out here. I don't know how well I can do that, but now obviously that's really sloppy, but that's approximately what I do. So yeah, let's move on to Ashley's second photo that we have here. This one blew me away. Super great colors right out of the camera. You see she was using 1/800th of a second at f1.8, ISO 100. Keeping your ISO at 100 during daylight is always great. because you won't end up with tons of noise. Now, she did send me this as a .cr2 file, so these blacks down here should have lots of detail in them still. CR2 or raw photos contain a lot more information in areas that are darker and areas that are super bright, which makes them great for editing. You can make sure your camera's shooting this by going into the settings and make sure your saving format is selected as being raw. This does make it so it's harder to view on some devices. Like, I don't think phones open up raw photos that well, but in terms of editing, it certainly makes it a lot better. And we can see if we take up our shadows here and our blacks, you can still see information was gathered in the rocks underneath their feet. Even though you couldn't even see them, it was just completely black. Obviously, it's not going to be the best information. It's a little bit noisy, but it's still there, and that helps you so much if you ever miss the exposure while you're shooting. I probably won't keep them that bright because I do like this contrasty look. Honestly, this photo looks amazing, and I think one thing that'll add to it is just a graduated filter coming from the side, like where the sun was coming from, just to add a bit of a glow from one of the corners. Obviously not that much, but just a little bit of a glow here. I'm gonna make it a little bit more pinky and then turn this down a little bit. I think that looks good for now. And then we're just gonna go do what we did in the last photos. Blue primary down, maybe not so much. This one we're actually gonna do red primary to a little bit more pink. So we pull the pink out of the sky. Green primary, we can bring it over here. We can bring this down to -23. Shadows, let's go green to make some contrast against the purple in the sky. The highlights are already pretty saturated, so we might not even have to do the highlights, but I would do the shadows to a teal, and then we'll bring that down just a little bit. So now for up here, I'm just gonna increase the exposure just like that. And one thing I am noticing is I think it's a little bit crooked. So one of the really cool tools in Lightroom that you have is you have this straighten tool. Most people start just trying to fiddle around with this, and it's super finicky. It just glitches everywhere, and it's really hard to get the right alignment. So let's just reset that, and then I'll show you a shortcut. You can click here on the straighten tool. You can click on something that you know in the photo straight. So I know this horizon is supposed to be straight across the photo. So I'll click on a little bit of the horizon, and then I'll line it with the other side of the horizon, and just like that, it straightens your photo to that line. So now that's all straightened up. Maybe let's bring the shadows up a little bit more. I don't want to see those bluey tones down here, so I might add another graduated filter down here, just like that, and reset our settings for it. And then I'm just going to bring down the saturation from below there, and then maybe just add a little bit more yellow to contrast the blue tones, maybe a little bit of purple to contrast the green of the teal, and like that, we lose the saturation in the bottom corner. Okay, I think in terms of exposure and everything, this is looking pretty good. I might add a little bit of clarity, but there's also a ton of clarity in the rocks already. So I'll come down here to the HSL tab, and this is where we're going to do the majority of the editing, or the big parts at least. I'm going to make the blue and the ocean a little bit more teal because I like teal, as I mentioned previously, but obviously it's a little bit too saturated, so we're going to take the saturation of the blue down, and we're also going to take the saturation aqua. Aqua is usually what you'll see in water. It's probably why it's called aqua. I might bring up the illuminance of the water a little bit too, so it's just a little bit brighter. And then let's work with this sunset. I think the sunset on its own already looks amazing, so there's not a lot to do with it, and we don't really have any skin tones to worry about, so we can play around with the orange and the red tones a little bit more without being worried about affecting it. Obviously that's way too red and that's way too yellow, so we got to try and find a happy medium. I usually tend to the more pinky purple side because I like that color, and I think it always looks good with the teal here. So I'm going to bring the orange down to more red, and I'm going to bring our red maybe a little bit. Let's put it to the orange side a little bit actually. I think that looks good. And then let's compare that with the original. So that's our original. This is our edit. I might actually get rid of some of the detail in the rock again, like that. I think that contrast actually looks better from the original photo. And then the other thing that I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna add one over these radial filters again, and we're gonna just blur out everything else in the photo so that all the attention is given to the subject. So let's bring clarity down, and let's bring sharpness down. And then let's bring these in a little bit. So yeah, I think this is how I'd edit this photo. Again, Ashley, amazing photo. Thank you for giving it to me to edit for you guys. And I'm really jealous of the sunset. I wish I got to be there. Let's move on to Steven's photo. Steven's one of my great friends from Toronto, and he sent this photo in of my other good friend, Alex. He's sitting on some sort of escalator. What I really liked about this photo was these leading lines that were pointing up towards Alex, and there's leading lines here and leading lines here. So I think there's a lot of lines. It's a little crooked, but honestly, I think it looks good like that. I might bring in the right side a little bit just to kind of match so he's more centered in the photo, and I might give him a little bit more headroom. Headroom's always important. You don't want the head of the person to feel like it's right by the very top of the photo. The more room you give the person, the better, but you never really want to have somebody's face or eyes below the middle of the photo. That looks really weird when you do that, but I think right about, I want to say, yeah, I think that's about good. Okay, so one thing I'm noticing about this photo is the focus isn't quite on his face. It's more like it's on his wrist here. That's a really small difference, but as you can see, he's shooting with a 50mm f1.8, which once again has a super shallow depth of field, and if your focus is just the tiniest little bit off, then it's going to result in the subject being a little bit out of focus. Now, it's not that bad. It's something we can probably recover and we can work with, and you honestly probably wouldn't even notice it if you were looking at the full image on a phone, but just on a big screen like this, I can see it, but we'll fix that. First things first, I think we can just bring up the shadows a little bit like that, and then let's see what we can do with the colors that we have down here. So we're going to go all the way back down to our blue primary, bring that down. We're going to bring the red up, more of yellow, and bring the saturation of that down. As you can see, when I hit the blue primary, it made his face all weirdly colored, so we just fixed that with our red primary here. There's not a lot of green that we can affect. There's a little bit in the teal down here, or on his pants from a reflection of some sort. And then shadows, let's just make the shadows, make them a little bit green. So we're going to come up here, add some sharpening. We're going to add more sharpening later to his face, but for now, let's just add a little bit of sharpening. Highlights, we'll do yellowy orange, a little bit of saturation in that, and then shadows we're gonna make teal, as always, just like so. So now, again, I wanna add a little bit more to the blacks and the shadows, because I see we're losing those details again, and I like the more pastel look where you can see everything in the photo, or basically everything in the photo. I don't like the super harsh, contrasty look. I just think it looks fake and unnatural. Obviously, my photos don't all look super natural. There's some of them that are very obviously edited, but if I can, I like to make it look like it's not crazy heavily edited. I think we're just gonna bring it to a little bit more purpley to get rid of some of the green that I'm seeing, and maybe just make it a little bit more blue. This photo to me feels like you're inside some sort of super modern, cold feeling building. So to match that mood, we'll just bring the temperature down a little bit, and we're gonna work on these blues and maybe these highlights at the top. We can add a graduated filter to fake some of that light coming in. We're gonna get rid of how yellow we're making that light, because it's no longer the sun, it's now an artificial light. So we're just gonna blow that out a little bit and then drag that down. So we're hitting his face a little bit with that graduated filter. Okay, so now that we've done our basic corrections there, we might add a little bit more clarity to give it that modern poppy feel. We're gonna first work in his skin tones, which are kind of all over the place right now. They don't look very natural. I think they're a little bit dark, so we can increase our luminance for those skin tones. And I think we're probably gonna have to do this quite a bit because they were very dark compared to the rest of the photo. And that should be about good. We're gonna decrease the saturation in the skin tones a little bit, maybe to about there. And then I'm gonna take out a little bit of the red from the skin tones and add a little bit more red to the lip tones. And then that's cool. I wanna make these blues more of a teal because I like teal. So I'm gonna bring that to there. And let's just decrease the saturation a little bit so it's not so heavy. So now we're going to compare this to the original so far. So that was the original, and this is what we have now. I'm seeing that the blues maybe are a little bit too much still, so let's just bring the saturation of those down again, and let's compare it again, there to there. I'm liking the look of that so far. For the reds, I might try and bring up the red a little bit more to bring out his hoodie, because I think his hoodie's a good contrast against the blue. And there's not much else in terms of color in the rest of the photo. It's just all blue and like orangey and red, which I like. Once again, that kind of split tone effect where you're not having a ton of colors to confuse the person who's looking. Subconsciously, the person is trying to process the image, and it's a lot easier on the eye if there's not a lot of colors that are distracting them, especially on things that aren't the subject of the photo. Now, if the subject of your photo is something that's super colorful and bright, then that makes more sense. So now I might come up here, and I think I might just correct the crookedness a little bit. I think it adds a cool effect, but it might just be a little bit too much. So I might bring it to about there and then adjust our crop again to bring him into the center. Okay, so I like the look of that. Now the one thing I still want to work on is the sharpening. It's just a little bit out of focus. Now obviously you can't bring it perfectly back into focus again, but there are a few things you can do to fix it to a certain extent. What I do is I open up a brush here and I just change all the settings back to 0. You can change something to 0 just by pressing it twice. That saves you the time of trying to drag it it perfectly to 0. And then what I usually do is I take a brush that has some clarity on it and then a bunch of sharpness, and I will just brush the parts that should have detail. Now, skin won't typically have a ton of detail in it, especially if it's taken from this far away, but places like the eyes and stuff, they should be a little bit more contrasty. There should be a sharper line between where it goes from like dark inside the eye to where it's light on the skin. So by adding clarity and sharpness, we're just increasing that border between the two so that it's sharper. Maybe some on the nose where there should be detail too. On the lips there should be some detail, and then especially in the hair. The hair is probably the biggest giveaway because the hair has so many little strands that should have detail in it. So that's where you can see that it's out of focus the most. So we're just gonna add some sharpness to the hair, and even just like that, like we're already starting to see that it looks sharper. If we zoom out here, it does look a little bit unnatural, but that's something that you could work on for a while to try and blend that in. But I don't quite have that much time. I know this video is already probably going on for a super long time, but I think I'm really happy with that. I think that to that is a great edit, and I really like this photo. Great job modeling, Alex, and great job taking the photo, Steven. Now, last but not least, we have a photo of my friend from Mexico named Lacey. This was taken at f8 at ISO 100 and 1/160th of a second on an 18mm. So that's super wide. The f-stop is pretty small, so you can see the background is really in focus, and that's something that we might work on in this one. I can show you guys how to kind of get rid of that background more, kind of like what we did earlier. Put this background out of focus as our eyes go from looking at the subject to looking at the trees, and we don't really want to look at the trees. Those just kind of want to be in the background. In our peripheral vision, we don't ever want our main point of focus to turn to the trees. What's cool about this photo is the leading lines again, leading in with the train track. So the first thing I do with this, I'm just going to bring up the shadows a little bit just so we can see the colors that are inside while we're editing our colors. So we go down here to blue primary, change that a little bit, green primary, a more orangey green this time, and less of a blue green. Red, we're gonna make that more yellowy, and then we're gonna bring the saturation of that down a lot. Tint, let's go with green tint to match the trees. Now we're gonna come up here, just increase the sharpness a little bit, and then let's work on our split toning. So split toning for our shadows this time, we're gonna be a little bit more on the green side or on the orange side so that we don't make these trees more blue, and we'll bring up that saturation just a little bit. Highlights, maybe a little bit orange, but literally with this split toning, you just have to do the slightest adjustment. You really don't want to bring it up like that. Split toning can be super strong, and it can make your photo look unnatural, but if you use it literally just like 1 and 2%, it makes a good difference. Now, if we come up to here, I think for clarity and everything, this is pretty good. I might just bring it up tiniest little bit, and then we're gonna add in one of our flares. Now, as you can see on her face here, the sun is coming in from the left-hand side. You can see her right-hand side of her face is shadowed, so this side is where the sun's coming in from. So we'll go on the left-hand side and drag in one of these, reset all the settings, and then make it look like our sun. So a little bit of yellow, a little bit of pink, and then a lot of brightness. Let's rotate that a little bit more to match the angle of the sun coming in from the sky and not just from the side. I might bring down the yellow a little bit and then maybe the brightness a little bit. For the most part, I think that looks good. Now we're also going to make the background more out of focus, so this will become a little bit less noticeable. But in terms of things here, I think I want to bring down the highlights so you get a little bit of the sky. We're going to bring down the whites so you get even more of the sky. I typically like to have the whites up, but I think in this case it's nice to try and get that blue of the sky back a little bit. Let's bring up the blacks and shadows a little bit more, and then we're just gonna work with our colors in our HSL tab. So the first thing I notice is the skin tone is pretty far off, so what we actually have to do is we have to come down here to saturation, decrease the saturation of the skin tone, increase the brightness. Now when you increase brightness, it also does take away some saturation, so be aware of that, but we're gonna take out some of that, increase the reds a little bit. Now I don't really like any of these other colors that are in here, so I think I might actually just bring down the blues in her shirt a little bit. Now that's gonna get rid of the blues in the sky, but I think it's worth it. If you had lots of time, you could come in here and brush out the blues so you could keep the blue in the sky. But I want to keep our colors down to these orangey colors on the tracks, the orangey, yellowy, greeny type colors in the trees, and the orange in the skin. So it's gonna be like a really rustic feel, which I think is good with these rusty train tracks. That's a good look to have. So to work on that a little bit more, let's go up to the skin tones, and I'm just gonna make her face a little bit more natural, and then I wish it it wasn't quite as dark in the shadows there. So I'm gonna bring the shadows in the face up a little bit just to bring back some of the detail in the hair. Now that's really getting rid of some of the nice shadows in the trees, but we can fix that when we add blur to the back of the trees. So in terms of color, I think that's better. Here was the original, that's the after. I think we're doing well so far. Now the one thing I really want to do is I want to blur out the background. We're gonna grab a radial filter and then we're gonna put it over the whole photo here and then just center that with her. See how it looks in terms of where it's affecting. That's a pretty good circle around her, and then we're going to take it and we're gonna make the radial filter back to clarity and sharpness. So these things come down, makes the background more blurred out. But what we are seeing is there's these parts close to her head that aren't quite affected enough because that's just blurring around like a circle. So right here, there's still sharpness in the trees and that looks unnatural. This is basically the same thing that an iPhone does in portrait mode. What it does is it takes a normal photo and it tries to find out what the subject is, and everything that it doesn't think the subject is, it makes out of focus. And this is where that goes wrong a lot of the times, is around the person themselves. You can't quite tell what the exact border of the subject is, so it doesn't de-sharpen that, or it takes away the sharpness of the subject itself. So it is difficult to do well. iPhones do a decent job at doing it, but honestly, I'd much prefer to use a normal camera that will do it naturally. And by bringing down your f number, you're gonna get that same effect. Now you can see this is a Canon 18-55 f3.5 to 5.6 lens. So the person taking the photo could have brought this photo down to f3.5 and you would have got the background a lot more out of focus, and that would have brought the attention to her more. And let's get rid of this part that's still in focus right behind her head. By clicking on this radial filter again and then heading over to brush, we can add brush marks to the radial filter. So let's just take our brush here and we're gonna brush around the head a little bit, trying our best not to hit her head with the brush so that we're only taking out the bushes. And I might even add a little bit of the brush stroke to our train tracks here, more to the trees, just to take the sharpness out of those as well. And I think that's already looking better. We're just gonna take some more out of the trees if we can. Now let's just see where this is affecting here. And you see it does overlap onto her a little bit. So what we will do is we will take our eraser now and we'll just erase over her to make sure that there's no de-sharpening on her. Perfect. And now if we hover over this, we can see that it doesn't affect her. Now we could get a lot more detailed in this and zoom in and make sure that we're making perfect lines, but obviously we don't have quite that time. It's already been a very long time. I know most of you guys have probably already gotten pretty bored. Most of you guys have probably clicked off this video, but if you guys are still here, thank you very much for watching. I hope this was informative in some way. I'm gonna export these and send them back to the people that sent them. I thank you all again for sending in their photos. I'm really sorry if I couldn't get to editing them. For sure, I'm gonna do this again. These photos were super awesome and I had a lot of fun editing them, and I hope you guys had fun watching. So thank you all for watching. Like, share, subscribe, do whatever you want. But obviously, if you guys do one of those things, it helps me a lot and I appreciate it. So, and share this with your friends. If your friends are photographers, if your friends want their photos edited next time, share this with them so that they can see what I do, who I am, that I'm a cool dude. Not really, but I try my best. I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.